All right, I think we're ready to begin. So thank you all for coming. I know that when you hear the word finance, the first thing that comes to mind is sex. Of course, probably there's research that says that's the first thing that comes to mind no matter what word you hear. But in any case, we thought it would be fun in the finance department to do a session on the business of love. And we have a really interesting panel that I know will have some things to say that you'll find fascinating. So let me quickly introduce the panel and we'll just get right to it. On my left here is Justin Garcia of the Kinsey Institute and also Noah Stoffman, who's a colleague of mine in the finance department. Noah and Justin and some others are doing some joint research that actually Noah is going to talk about. And that's why you have these clickers. You're going to do a little interactive research here with you. And Justin is going to talk a little bit about how technology is shaping the way that love and romance happens today. And then on my right over here is Maggy Siegel. Maggy is a member of our Dean's Council. She was just telling me, she has 2 degrees from IU and multiple degrees in her family. So she's a great IU supporter. Maggy has been involved with lots of different businesses that have sort of a love connection. Dylan's Chocolate Bar, Tiffany, Chanel, and so on. And so Maggy is going to talk to us a little bit from kind of a retail and brand perspective about the business of love. So with that introduction, let's start with Justin Garcia.
Okay, that's good. Are we on? Okay. So a little bit about my own background. I'm actually not from the business world in my own training. I'm not only because I'm at Kinsey, I'm actually an evolutionary biologist by training. But over the last few years, we've become more interested in trying to understand what are concepts from evolutionary biology. What does an understanding of the human species and a comparative perspective or understanding aspects of our brain and what we are in a natural history framework help explain things like love and sex? So I'm going to talk through, just highlight a few pieces today, and feel free to jump in and certainly not everything. There we go. So the concept of love or marriage is also very much rooted in American tradition and American culture, right? And there's something unique about this concept of looking for someone that could be a romantic partner, someone to share a union with. Plato suggested that we're all looking for our other half. We spend eternity looking to complete ourselves, suggesting that it's different than a sexual union. I imagine you go into a bar and ask someone to have sex with you, and they say no. Okay, you go home. But if you tell someone theoretically, if you tell someone you love them and your love is rejected, we know the cross-cultural evidence, the biological evidence, the American history evidence suggests that this is a reaction that's quite unique. This is a reaction that's quite intense, right? That can drive us to the very edges of sanity. We live for love, we paint for love, we sing for love, we dance for love, we create culture for love. There's something very unique about that desire. So we could see also that these traditions that go around love. So marriage, when I think of marriage, I think of a political and legal structure that sits around a natural history of love. And I'll get to what I mean by that when I say natural history. But we know that these traditions have changed very much in the last few decades in American culture, from a concept perhaps that was more focused on the union to more focused on aspects of what are the pieces that are necessary. Is it the right type of dress? Is it the right type of suit? Is it the right type of venue? So questions that inherently start to engage with business, right? Questions that inherently start to say, well, it's not just about how much you love that person. It's about the story that's built around that love, the products that perhaps represent that love. And when I say products, I don't mean that in a bad way. Gift giving is very much a part, and I don't want to jump in before Maggie, but gift giving, and a funny one said Tiffany. When I was young, I was in high school and going to college, and I remember I was dating someone, and my mom said to me, every woman loves that little turquoise bag. And I still remember it, and I was like, this is the root, though, of gift giving, right? This concept that there's some type of gift. And that's true of species all over. Chimpanzees on the Ivory Coast exchange meat for sex. Perhaps we're not that crude, but certainly this concept that we engage in gifts. And the very notion that marriage is an exchange of gift is also something. Donald Trump ex-wife was interviewed once, and a reporter said, would you have married him if he weren't a multimillionaire? And his wife laughed at the reporter and goes, do you think he would have married me if I weren't a model? So the very idea that relationships, whether they be sexual or romantic, are an exchange of goods. That has always been the case. That probably always will be the case. But there's also a new component of relationships, particularly in contemporary society, and that's that they're taking on a representation in their own way, that they've become part of entertainment, that there's new concepts in the way that technology can influence the way that we perhaps express our love, the way that we show love culturally. I mean, this is the very concept that there's a TV shows, and this isn't the only one, built around this notion of forming love relationships. What are involved? And if who here watches some of these shows, either this one or Millionaire Matchmaker, or I particularly like that one. And there's little hands are going up. There's the very notion that this is going on to describe culturally how we think about love today, I think is really interesting. And what we see, the stories that are built are very much around that performance, right? So, when I think about marriage, again, I said, there are a couple of things that we like to think about that are just outside necessarily the social institution. In the U.S., at least, approximately 90% of Americans eventually marry, and about half divorce. And approximately 95% of Americans have premarital sex by age 44. The by age 44 is an important part. But at least putting this into a framework of what are these patterns that we're seeing in America. And this goes into what a biologist would call human pair bonding. And pair bonding is the idea that when two conspecific species, typically of the opposite sex, but not always of the opposite sex, will form unions. They form bonds. And those bonds are often for the purposes of mutually raising offspring, for mutual territory defense. Humans are what we call cooperative breeders in that sense, this notion that it takes a village to raise a family. It's not this kind of classic notion of women barefoot, pregnant, naked in the kitchen, raising offspring, breastfeeding them. That's actually not, there is no evidence in the anthropological literature that that's how families were raised. Fathers have always had important influence. Kin and other family members have always been involved. This notion that families have been important to human evolutionary history, and that raising offspring occurs in these family units, well, that tells us something about the power of pair bonds, I think inherently. Because the very notion that there are these families raising offspring tell us that, well, there must be these unique relationships, perhaps those love relationships that run much deeper than simply our representation, that keep people together in order to raise those offsprings. And in fact, every society anthropologists have looked, there's evidence of romantic love. 151 out of 166 societies. There is no evidence in the anthropological literature of any society that doesn't have a concept of love. And in fact, recent images, my colleague Helen Fisher took people who were madly in love and put them in an fMRI scanner and scanned their brain. And a small part of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, a pea-sized part in the center of the brain that's associated with dopamine production, is activated when you're viewing partners that you're romantically in love with. And actually, when people break up, they did another study, a follow-up study, where people who had just broken up were put into an fMRI. I mean, this is terrible for these people. They had just broken up, and you put them in an fMRI scanner, and their brain looks exactly like someone going through cocaine withdrawal. So the concept that there is something more biological going on in these types of relationships, I think, is important. Okay, so now to think about who are these partners that we choose. Of course, there are volumes written on this, so I'm speeding through. When we think about mate choice, perhaps a way for me to connect to your world is that we can think about mate choice as an economic exchange. We can think about the fact that there is limited resources, it's an exchange of goods, and there's rewards for high status. A classic example by biologists is the peacock. So the male peacock has this elaborate plumage. It's actually not a tail, it's a train. Biology is your biology fact for the day. And the peahen, the female, actually doesn't have that same coloration. And the reason behind that is what we call sexual selection theory. So the males want to show, look how hot I am, look how nice I look how much I take care of my plumage, I'm eating the right things, I'm avoiding the right parasites, and I can look this good, and I can even do it in the face of predators. And the female, on the other hand, her evolutionary interests are perhaps protecting herself and offspring. She doesn't need to have that plumage because she doesn't need it to advertise to the males. And a lot of people have used this very framework of sexual selection theory to explain a whole bunch of behaviors that humans engage in, ranging from the way that we purchase cars to the ways that young males compete with each other, particularly young males compete with each other, often to impress potential partners. And it's also a sign, something interesting about peacocks, it's also a sign when male peacocks fight with each other, they step on each other's feathers and try and pull them out. So they purposely make each other look bad to the females. So if they win the fight, so it has to do with all these different things. And why would this be important from a biological perspective? Well, that's because in theory, mate choice has to do with selecting quality genes. It has to do with selecting a partner. And what Professor Stoffman will talk about after me is how those heuristics, how we can engage in these things like mate choice, how those very simple heuristics of what we like, what we don't like, can then be turned into other types of decisions we make. So, but I will not jump the gun. So I want to take a note, though. When I say pair bonding, we often think about humans as being a monogamous species. That's socially monogamous. It's not the same as sexually monogamous. Biologists differentiate between socially and sexually monogamous. There's only about 3% of mammals, 15% of primates that are socially monogamous, but almost all of them engage in sexual infidelities. But at the same time, so here are gibbons, actually. They're a close relative of ours. They're in apes. They live in the rainforests of Southeast Asia. They swing through the trees at speeds of 35 miles per hour, and they sing these beautiful, deep songs to each other. And the longer they're in a pair bond, their songs actually become more harmonious with each other. I mean, this is a love story, right? They sing to each other, and if one of them dies or falls out of a tree or gets eaten by an eagle, they won't sing the same love song to another gibbon. Isn't this? People could learn a lot from gibbons. But the idea is that this is another very closely related species that engages in this type of pair bonding behavior, right? So I just want to build this framework in the way that I think about love relationships. In a study of ours that we did, we asked a little over 500 people, at some point, these were young people, college students, at some point in your life, would you like to be in a traditional romantic relationship? One third said, yes, I'm currently in one, I think they're great, I want to be in more. And 2/3 said, yes, I do at some point. Only 2 out of 507 said, I'm not interested in relationships. My joke is often that one probably is honest and the other probably just broke up from someone and said, I don't want to deal with anyone ever again. But about 1 in 500 are the numbers we would expect for people who just aren't interested in relationships. But the vast majority of people at some point in their life, even if we see things like sexual relationships, uncommitted relationships, particularly among college students and sometimes graduate students, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a desire for a long-term relationship. It is one of the most fundamental human universals. So I want to talk a little bit about patterns and move into technology, and it's a short amount of time, so covering a lot, and how this framework can perhaps inform things. Part of that biological framework, some people argue that humans are what we call seasonal breeders, and that is that things like courtship, which include things like gift giving, then dating, to then forming attachments, to then engaging in sexual activity and reproduction, that these all happen on these predictable cycles. And what's interesting to me is that we can now start to map these onto some other cycles that are going on that are perhaps more finance relevant and more business relevant. In a recent study we did, we looked at when people were going on online dating sites. And what we saw is that with Match.com participants at least, that there's a real spike around January. So those of you actually who are looking for love, now is the time of year to do it. The peak season goes from about November to about February, a little bit after Valentine's Day. And at first, I thought there were two things going on. I still think there are two things going on. One has to do with love stories, our very notion of the way love forms. And we all have these ideals in our head that we try and achieve. But the other, I think, also has to do with something perhaps a bit more biological. They're mapping onto these very classic patterns of when people are forming these types of relationships. When we looked at the numbers of what was going on, 67% of people who are single, who are on Match, said it had to do with they were looking to find love. Their New Year's resolution was looking to find love. That's why there's this spike a few days right after New Year's. A quarter of people said, well, I broke up with someone over the holidays, so I'm ready to get back into the game. And 82% said the holidays make them feel more romantic. And that's this concept that, this very concept that there's something else going on around these holidays that do something to us cognitively, that make us want to say, I'm ready to get into a relationship. There are all these commercials on. There are all these people talking about relationships. But what about that idea of kissing someone in the snow? I want that to happen. The snow, I only have 2 months left of snow. I have to find a partner. So we have these stories that we want to achieve. But there's also these predictable patterns of sexual behavior, not just romantic love. As the condom industry is well aware, there's spikes in condom sales. Condom sales tend to go up the days right around Valentine's Day, also the days right around Christmas. So it's not unique necessarily just to things like Valentine's and love. It's also unique to Christian holidays. And I'll make no further comment. I just report data. But this is a well-known trend. And there are these aspects that are related to our love and sex lives that predictably repeat themselves. I want to touch on 2 studies quickly by colleagues of mine that also look at, so we've gone from looking at these patterns on an annual cycle to looking at them on a monthly cycle. A lot of interest lately, particularly engaging with the business sciences, is understanding women's fertility, understanding what we call fecundity, actually, a propensity to engage, to reproduce. And there's been a lot of interest in looking at across women's menstrual cycles and how that might tell us something about certain predictable behavioral patterns because of the changing hormones that women experience, particularly when they're not on any types of birth control. So here is a study that was in the Journal of Consumer Psychology last year. And what they found is, if you look at the y-axis, it's the amount of money spent. The x-axis is the days prior to menstrual onset, and you could see the fertile phase is here and the luteal phase is here of a woman's menstrual cycle. And you could see that amount spent on clothing exceeds the amount spent on food only when women are most fertile. So the argument then has something to say about the fact, and this is just one of several studies that are kind of using this framework, and the argument then is that when there is a shift, when, in this case, a woman experiences a shift in her peak fecundity, her ability to reproduce, the priorities, the biological priorities begin to shift. And perhaps here we get into a time of the month that more women are willing to socially engage. So it doesn't necessarily, I'm a little hesitant of the argument, I also have an appointment in gender studies, so I'm a little bit hesitant of the argument that women are just trying to dress up and find a guy when they're fertile, although that's the sort of common, quick argument. But I think it's that it's a different physiological state. And so willingness and interest in engaging in social engagements, whether they be going out with friends or they going out on dates, changes. But something is certainly happening that's mapping onto these ovulatory cycles. And this isn't the only study that's shown this. Here's another now classic study from 2007 looking at, on the y-axis is dollars earned among strippers. And the y-axis is where the women were in their cycle. The bottom line is women who are using pills, who are on hormonal contraceptives, which of course create a physiological state much like pregnancy. And here are women not on hormonal contraceptives. And those women, when they're at the peak of fertility in their menstrual cycles, is when they earn the most in tips. So there's a whole lot we could say about why that is, or what might be happening. But certainly there's been a slew of studies that have started to demonstrate that there are these patterns that are happening, and very much tied to biology. So my sort of take-home message there is we really need to start to think about the ways in which biology might be impacting our sexual lives, our romantic lives, our dating interests, the way we're forming relationship and engaging in others. I want to quickly end with some information. Since 2010, I've been working with the online dating site Match.com on a study called Singles in America. And Singles in America is trying to understand who single Americans are. There's over 100 million single Americans, a third of the US adult population. It's a historically unprecedented portion of an adult population. No society in the world has ever witnessed so many singles. This is a group with enormous power. I mean, the power to radically transform American culture if they so choose. But then the question is, how are they in some ways? So I just threw out a couple of things that I thought might be of interest to a finance group that we're finding in our data analysis this year. And here's an interesting one that I think also engages with concepts of gender studies. Who should pay for the first date? So this is a sample of 5,400 single Americans. It's not people who are on Match.com. It's based on the US Census. So we have the right number of men, women, black, white, gay, straight, East Coast, West Coast. And what we can see here, I thought this was interesting, is who should pay on a date? The person who initiated the date, a third of people say, but almost over a quarter of people say the man should still date. And that's interesting because at least from an initial sort of sociobiological take, the notion that men are doing the primary gift giving is what you might expect. And I think the fact that this has come down so low is a suggestion that local social, cultural factors that are telling us how we can be more egalitarian in dating relationships and romances is what's pushed this number so low. In a traditional society, or perhaps even several decades ago, you would expect this number to be closer to 100%. But the fact that there are all these changes happening, and this is a study we've done over the last few years. Then we asked people in another question, how likely are you to consider getting into a committed relationship with someone? So I pulled out those that were sort of economically relevant. 85% of people said that they would consider getting in a relationship with someone who makes more money than them. Interesting that 15% of people said that they wouldn't, right? 58% said they would be willing to consider a relationship with someone who makes considerably less money than them. Over a third would consider it if the person had considerable credit card debt, and 46% if the person had considerable student loan debt. Then I pulled some that were different, that really didn't necessarily have anything to do with economics. To put it in perspective, almost 2/3 of people said that they would consider someone from a different religious background. That's also something fairly unique. For the last 15 years, relationships researchers have been saying that, well, when we ask, what do you want in a partner? Well, most people want someone of the same socioeconomic background, the same religious background, the same life experiences. That's been the classic party line in relationship research. Only more recently, partly with this study and several others, are we starting to realize that those norms are breaking down in American culture. That there's more interest, more focus on the love relationship and not necessarily the checkboxes that characterize that. Also, 50% of people would date someone more than 10 years older. I didn't separate that by gender, but there's a big sex difference in that. In most societies in the world, women date men who are considerably older than them. And only a quarter said that they would date someone who has different reproductive goals. This makes perfect sense to me as a biologist. People want to have similar reproductive goals, like having children. And then I just want to end with this one because I thought it was interesting. And I think it's an important point to make when we think about finances. The down economy can't stop love. Over the last 3 years, it's been about 60% of singles have said that changes in their own finances and the economy has not changed their dating habits at all. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's kind of low. What's your point? My point is that for 60% to say that not at all their dating habits have changed is remarkable. Given what's happened in the U.S. economy, given the financial changes that we've seen over the last few years, that dating is something ranking so high on so many people's priorities list that they're not changing it at all, I think is remarkable. And I think it's a testament to the drive for love, the desire for finding those endearing romantic relationships. Okay, I'm done.
Okay. Actually, before I get started, I think there were a couple people who came in and might not have one of these little white clickers. I'm going to ask you some skill testing questions, so not really skill testing. Oops. Anyone else need one over there? Okay. So I'm Noah Stoffman. I'm a professor in the finance department and have never given a talk about anything to do with sex or biology ever before. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a pretty new project, and we have some preliminary results, but I thought you might be interested just to hear even about the process of gathering the data. And so this is a project that we're calling Beauty in the Eye of the Shareholder. Actually, I just noticed that one of the co-authors, Ryan Israelson, is standing in the back. And so this is with Justin and actually Scott Yonker, whose wife had a baby yesterday, so speaking of sex. Okay. And so, so Justin sort of hinted that because of the sort of evolutionary or biological, however you want to understand it, people often use heuristics to make quick decisions about anything, about a person, about, you see someone and very quickly you make a judgment about what you think that, how that person would, how smart they are, how nice they are, how wealthy they are, that sort of thing. And so what we're doing in this project is asking how that might affect something like stock prices, okay? So Before I get into that, let me just tell you a little bit about some of the research that's been done on soft skills and soft information. And what I mean by that are sort of the squishy things that actually financial economists don't usually think about. So for example, if you look at the risk attitudes of CEOs, they tend to be more optimistic and more risk tolerant than the lay population. So if in surveys of CEOs and comparing them to answers from non-CEOs, this is what you find. But then you start to get into some of these sort of heuristic things where, so people rate when they're shown, this is a study from Duke where it was online, people would see two pictures right next to each other. One of them was a CEO and one of them wasn't, and they didn't know, the subjects didn't know which was which. And what that study showed is that, to a remarkable degree actually, people rate CEOs as they look more competent, but less likable than non-CEOs. And the executive, and actually executive compensation is correlated with the perceived competence. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. What this means is that someone looks at a picture, quickly makes a judgment about how competent that person is, and it turns out that split-second judgment is actually correlated with that executive's compensation. Now, as a professor, actually, I find this a little disheartening because there was a study at Harvard a few years ago where they showed very short video clips of professors teaching. And they asked subjects to evaluate how likable that professor was just from a 10-second video clip. And they showed actually a very high, a surprisingly high, shockingly high correlation between those survey results and the true teaching evaluations at the end of the semester. So in other words, you don't need to sit in a class for the whole semester to make a decision about or to figure out how a teacher is going to be evaluated. It turns out you can look at them for 10 seconds and get the answer. So as a professor, that's kind of upsetting, right? Because you know, hopefully the semester would matter. There's some other research that shows that firms, just looking at male CEOs, firms whose male CEOs have wider faces relative to facial height achieve superior financial performance, and I'm sure Justin could tell us something about why wider faces, people find them more attractive or whatever, I don't know. So there's some of this stuff that's sort of this sort of interesting stuff in the literature showing how these kinds of physical characteristics can have pretty interesting real-world effects. This one is very interesting. There's a peer-to-peer lending site called prosper.com you may be familiar with. And people, when you ask for a loan on this site, you post a picture. And people who appear more trustworthy have a better chance of getting their loans funded. Now, what's particularly interesting about that is you can put any picture you want, right? It's it's basically an anonymous site. So I could put a picture of Brad Pitt. And why, so why would the picture that you put have anything to do with people's decisions whether or not to fund your loan? Because it's transparent that this picture might not even be of you. Which is, I think an interesting result. So a couple other examples, and there's been sort of really, nobody was doing this kind of research 10 years ago. This is all sort of really, really new stuff that people are looking at. So male CEOs who have deeper voices, and notice that when I said that, my voice got lower. That was subconscious. They manage larger companies, and they make more money. And so a 1% decrease in voice pitch is associated with a $30 million increase in the size of the firm, and these are statistically significant numbers, and $19,000 more in annual income. Okay, so again, that's saying that now, why would voice pitch matter? Well, there could be all kinds of reasons that would be driving this. Okay, it could be sort of that that the voice pitch that voice pitch is correlated with other things, or it could be that people just are somehow, they like the person who has a deeper voice or something more. There's also some evidence or some research that something called vocal dissonance markers are positively associated with the likelihood of accounting irregularity restatements. And so what that means is that listening to these conference calls with corporate CEOs, listening to the tone, not just what they say, but how they say it, you can actually make predictions about the likelihood of future accounting irregularities. And there's actually a company I'm sure there's more than one, but this is an example of a company that is actually producing reports based off of this kind of information. They call their analysis cognitive and emotion analysis, and what they say on their website. I mean, they're kind of secretive, so I don't know exactly what they're doing, but they say it's drawn from interview techniques from the FBI and the CIA and the Israeli Mossad, and so they put out reports after conference calls about sort of whether they think that the CEO or that the news that was coming out was good or bad. So I put two examples here. One is ADP. And so it says management generated highly questionable markers when talking about growth in average client fund base balances and when talking about revenue and business growth. So this would be seen as a negative sign that this company, that equity and analysis and strategy is sending out. And then here's an example with Cisco, and they're saying that management generated highly confident markers. Okay, so this is sort of looking at or listening to what people are saying and using it to evaluate the chance that they're, for example, telling the truth. So with that in mind, and actually I should say, when we started thinking about this research, we kind of happened to meet Justin, but before that we were sort of thinking about this, but we really didn't know what the literature had shown, and having met Justin, we've sort of learned a lot more about what's out there, and it's quite interesting to have this collaboration in that dimension. So our research questions that we're asking in this project are, do traders react differently to the appearance on CNBC of a CEO, depending on what that CEO looks like? Okay, and how long does it take the effect to last, and what kinds of firms are affected? Okay, and so what's interesting, I mean, the idea here is to say, a CEO appears on television, traders, whoever's watching CNBC might make a quick judgment about that person just based on their appearance on television, and then trade on that. And so we're just going to look in the data and see whether you can find an effect like that, okay? So before you kind of get to that, you have to ask the question, well, how fast might you expect information to be reflected in prices? Okay, so someone shows up on TV, should you look over the next week to see if there's an effect, or should you look over the next few minutes? And in fact, there's a couple papers that show really how fast information from television is incorporated into stock prices. So the first paper that looked at this was a couple professors who looked at, this was 10 years ago, and they taped CNBC segments, not when CEOs showed up, but when analysts appeared on television to talk about a company. And they showed that within seconds, you start to see an effect, and that trading intensity doubles in the first minute. So there's a very fast reaction. And this was 10 years ago, before the huge growth that we've seen in high-frequency trading, so you would expect even faster numbers now. There's a PhD student in economics at Berkeley who's written a paper recently, and he looks at stock price performance on after a company's mentioned on CNBC. He just looks over the next 24 hours, and he shows that there's a significant increase in the stock price at the precise time that a company is mentioned on CNBC following a positive news event. And then he points out the sort of surprising fact that also after negative news, there's a price rise, which suggests that it actually just has something to do with attention. That it's, this guy, they're talking about this company on TV, maybe I should buy it. And so he has this picture that shows, this is sort of the news event itself in the blue line. The first time it's mentioned is the red line. This is all relative to time zero, so when the event occurs or when the mention happens. And then this is a second mention later in the day, and there's still an effect, which suggests that people are responding to stale information. But so what this tells us is, okay, if we want to look for an effect, we're going to have to look pretty quickly, okay? And so let's see what happens. So how did we get this data? Well, the first step was we downloaded hundreds of CEO interview videos from the CNBC website. They have them on their website. We downloaded them. And then we used a tool that I wanted to talk about for a minute because I wasn't sure if you would be familiar with it and thought you might be interested, called Amazon Mechanical Turk. And so I have this picture here. The Mechanical Turk was a hoax that was it was a contraption that was built in the 1770s, I think, and toured around Europe, and it was passed off as a mechanical person, a robot, basically, but 200 and something years ago, that could play chess. Okay, and for a very long time, people sort of at least partly believed that really this was some kind of mechanical device that could play chess, and this is well before computers or everything. Now, it turned out that actually there was a little man hiding inside, and he would play the chess. Okay, but so Amazon has basically created exactly the same thing, except it's not just for playing chess. It's a website where you can pay people to do a task for you. Okay, and so you can see why it's called Mechanical Turk, because it sort of looks like it's automatic, but actually you're paying a person to do it. And you can pay people just tiny little amounts of money to do little straightforward tasks. So what we did was we paid several thousand people 5 cents to watch a video. Okay, so every time, and they would watch many videos, and however many they chose, and every video that they watched, we would pay them 5 cents. And it only took 30 seconds to watch a video, and then we would ask them some questions. And so if they worked on this for an hour, they would make, I don't know, $4 or something. And so we showed, actually, I'll just tell you one anecdote. So I was curious what kind of people were doing our task for us. And so I noticed, because I could track the IP addresses, I noticed that there was somebody from a hardware store in Seattle who would, he would do them, but they were very sporadic. So I think what was happening was he would like do one, and then a customer would come in, and then he'd do a couple, and then a customer would come in, and then he would do a couple more. So who's doing this? It's people in there while they're at work. So we showed 500 videos, 30-second clips each, to 30 different people. Okay, so each video was watched by 30 different people. And then after this 30-second clip, we asked them to rate the CEOs on how attractive they were, how aggressive they were, how intelligent, friendly, and trustworthy. Okay, so this is just based on your 30-second impression. And we also collected demographic data about the raters. And then we used statistical methods to adjust for sort of people's individual opinions to try to get sort of a sense of really what the true level of how on all these dimensions was for each person. And so the website that they were on, it sort of looked like this. When they were done, they were just shown these questions, and we made the questions in a random order every time, and they would just fill it in, and we'd collect the data. So what I want to do is, and this is what the clickers are for, I'm going to show you 2 videos, 30-second clips, and when the clip is over, I'm just going to ask you about how attractive you think the person is. And so it's not going to be this guy. It's the CEO who is being interviewed in this video. Okay? So here we go. Oops, hang on. That didn't work. Let's see. Nope. Oh, no. Media unavailable. Why is that?
Internationally. Well, I think we're still telling the story of our company. So there's a lot of people who don't. We've been very successful demonstrating that we are a very good North American wholesale apparel company. But I think the next opportunity for us is as we move into new categories like footwear, new distribution channels like the mall, and of course new geographies like going international, that story will be told. But we're much more about the Under Armour 2020 story than we are about Under Armour 2011 or 2012.
A lot of people are talking about the international growth potential. Only about 6% of Under Armour's earnings are from.
Okay. Now you have to set the channel to 14. So at the bottom of your clicker, there's a button that says CH. Just press CH and then type 14, and then I think you press CH again. And then just select an answer 1 through 7, where 1 is not at all attractive. No, let's see. I'm not getting any responses, which makes me think. Hang on. Yeah, it's in. Should have tested this before. 1, 4. Oops. All right. Well, that didn't work. Okay. We'll move on. Instead of being fancy with technology, raise your hand if you think this person is quite unattractive. Okay, nobody thinks he's unattractive. Raise your hand if you would give him a 7, a very attractive. Handful of people, okay? How about 5 or higher? Okay, so this guy, generally, the audience thinks he's fairly attractive. Okay, let's go on to the next person, and we'll do it again.
That some of the tax policies that have been put in place, like the expensing of new equipment, may sunset, and that would take, I would think, a little bit of a tailwind away from you. How do you react?
Well, this year we have the $500,000 Section 179 and the bonus depreciation, but if you look at this, we've had all this accelerated depreciation for our customers for the last, 2-3 years, and basically with all the new machinery that's been bought, most of these customers.
All right. Again, that's not going to work. So let me just, we'll do by a show of hands. Who would say that he is not at all attractive? Quite a few people. Who would say that he's very attractive? Not many. Now, maybe there's an anonymity problem here, which is why the clickers would have been nice. But so I didn't pick these videos at random, actually. I picked them based on how people rated. And in fact, that guy, and I certainly don't want to be mean to him, but he was actually considered to be the ugliest of our 484 people, and the first guy was one of the best looking. Okay. Now, my only so there's some variation when you look across CEOs and how attractive they are, and some of them are really not that attractive. And so what we do is we asked subjects how attractive they were, and so what you see here are just histograms of these variables. And so what's interesting actually is you notice the attractive one, I mean, it does somewhat look like it does have this kind of normal distribution, which you would expect, but it also, there aren't that many sort of people in the super attractive area. And what's interesting when you compare this distribution to the other questions we asked, like friendly, trustworthy, intelligent, is it's actually a lot more flat, which means that there's a lot more variation in how good-looking people are, but there's much less variation in things like intelligence. Like basically, people tend to think they're more intelligent. Okay, so then what we did, so this ended up working for 484 videos that we showed each to 30 different people, and we have people. What was going to show? So most of the people who are answering are between, or about a little more than half of the people that are answering are between the ages of 21 and 30. So it's kind of people in their 20s, but we also have some older people, and there's actually a fair bit of agreement on sort of how good-looking people are. And what's interesting also is that when you look at the correlations, where is attractive? So attractive tends to be positively correlated with some of these other things. So it's certainly the case that people aren't going to easily be able to kind of separate in their mind this person's good looking versus this person looks like a nice person. And then what we do is quite simply look at what happens to the stock price in the minutes after this person appears on television. Okay, now this chart that I'm showing you is actually just for the smallest companies, and I'll explain that in a second. But what you see is this is the moment the person appears on television. For the less attractive people, within the next minute, the price has gone down. For the more attractive people, the price has actually gone up. And there is this kind of big, statistically significant difference for just a few minutes, and then it goes away. And when you look, I've cut this picture. When you look afterward, it's sort of, there's nothing there. So there's a very, very short, but statistically significant difference, which suggests two things. One, some people are actually reacting to this measure of attractiveness, but two, it quickly goes away. So that is that other traders who aren't focused on something potentially as silly as how good looking the guy is, come and sort of move the price back to where it should be, sort of a market efficiency kind of argument. So the one other thing I'll say is that, so this is looking at small firms, and the reason why, and the effect is bigger for small firms than it is for big firms, which makes sense because, you know, if a guy like Bill Gates shows up on TV, I mean, everyone knows what Bill Gates looks like. It's not informative to see Bill Gates, you've seen him before, but if some guy from a smaller company is on CNBC, chances are you may never have seen him before, and so that's sort of, you know, new information about what the person looks like. So. Time. Oh, minutes. Yeah, minutes. So within less than 4 minutes, the effect is basically gone. So it's a very short-lived, but yeah. We had some women in the sample. I can't remember actually if these results. I think we threw. There's some women, but mostly men. And actually, the women tend to be rated higher, probably because, well, there's. No, what I was going to say is that we have more males in our rater sample, but also I think males tend to be more critical of other males. One of the things that we noticed in the ratings is that the women raters rated everybody higher than the male raters. So women seem to be kind of more generous in their ratings than men. But I guess maybe not towards women. So anyway, yeah.
But how would you actually compare this to if you meet a person in person rather than seeing it on TV? Because on a television, isn't everybody good looking, right? I mean, even the newsreaders are. So then if the CEO shows up, he's a normal guy, regular guy, who's not a TV guy, then I mean, something like this is bound to happen otherwise.
Well, I don't know if something like, I mean, you're saying, I mean, I don't think you're bound to see an effect like this. I mean, I don't think you would, I mean, I was pretty surprised to see, if I told you that, you know, when an ugly person is on TV, the price of his stock falls, even if he's talking about good news, I mean, I think that's a pretty surprising, I would not have expected that. Yeah.
We do control for the host of the show.
Okay.
So if you've got a very attractive host, we're going to control for that.
Right, so one thing we were thinking, I mean, so hosts tend to be pretty good looking, but you know, it might be interesting if maybe you have a particularly attractive host and, you know, how that might change people's views. Yeah.
Is there any sort of correlation between how familiar people are with some of these brands and companies, as well as, you know, the CEO?
Right. No, that's a good question. We don't know yet. The only thing that we've looked at, and as I said, this is really new research. The only thing we've looked at is the size of the company, which is certainly going to be correlated with something like brand recognition, but we haven't yet. And absolutely, yeah, it's a great question. We need to look at that.
We've looked at how new the firm is, and we see similar results.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, what about other information given like during the interviews? Because I remember when I seen like the first interview with Under Armour CEO,
yeah,
and there's a line underneath that says he was the former captain of the Philippines football team, and that instantly gave me like credit to want to like the guy.
Right, right. Yeah, that's so that's fine. I mean, so yeah, we're not currently controlling for that. It would be difficult to do it, but you know, I mean, it could be that something like how good looking you are is correlated with some of those other measures of success. I mean, the other thing is when you see a guy who's really not that attractive, you wonder, well, how is he a CEO of a big company? If looks matter so much. And well, so one of the things that could be going on is actually these are people who actually founded the company. They started the company themselves. It's not like someone else hired them, right? I feel.
If they are seeing the video,
yeah.
Something like this comes up, it should be reflected in the views of the guys who are seeing it. There may be some other characteristics. I'm saying that it will be reflected in their.
Oh, yeah. So right. So his point is that might be that when we showed this to the viewers, to the raters, that they would also incorporate that kind of information. But not. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, maybe it would depend probably on the type of information it was.
Yeah, we're still working on controlling for the content of the interview.
So. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I will turn it over to Maggie, who I guess is going to talk about totally different things.
Do you know how to?
Sure. Yeah, let me get your slides up here.
There it is.
This is you?
This is me.
Great.
All right.
And The blue button is the laser, and if you push this, sort of click it down, it moves next page. Yeah.
I am here because I love Indiana University so much, and I have to confess, when I got asked to do this and I looked at the calendar and saw there was going to be an away game last night, I thought, gee, I can go to Nick's with my friends and everybody will be in such a good mood today. I never would have done this had I known 0.9 seconds would really make that big a difference. I have a much higher voice than Professor Stoffman, which means I get paid a lot less money. So there we go. This is an overview of a lot of different products that are about love, that people buy because of love. And we can define love in all kinds of ways, and we'll come to that. No one needs anything we're going to talk about today. None of these are necessities, and Professor Garcia already answered the question, so what happens to these categories in a recession, and what was the answer? They're fine. They're fine. So that's good news, because I have worked at a lot of companies. Let's get all of these up here. So you're going to see, we're going to talk about each one of these, and actually you touched on some of them, but there's a couple more depending on how you define love. I thought of funerals. You don't really have to spend a lot of money on a funeral, but you must love that person, but we're not going to talk about that today. Pets. Oh my God, people spend a fortune on their pets, all because of love. Toys, kids, all that. But we're going to go through these couple of things, and I think it'll be fun. So, online dating. How can you ignore it? $4 billion around the world now. Where did this exist? 10 years ago? And that gets me thinking, what were people spending that money on then? Where did they take business away from? People going to bars more? Or how did they used to meet people? I don't really know the answer to that, but this is a really big category. Is it a trend? Is it going to go away? Doesn't appear so. It keeps growing, and there are more and more of them, although Match certainly seems to be the winner in them, but just an amazing business. Does anybody know the first movie that featured this, one of the all-time greatest movies ever made? You've Got Mail, 1998, right? A little bit of social media, how they partnered on a chat room. Love that movie. Music. Oh my gosh, such a big part of everybody's love life. You have a song you remember. And of course today, one of the biggest loved ones, Taylor Swift, and her wonderful words from Love Story. Romeo, save me. I've been feeling so alone. I keep waiting for you, but you never come. I keep waiting for you. Is this in my head? I don't know what to think. He knelt to the ground and pulled out a ring. We're all back to, she talks about such simple things, although I don't know why anyone would ever date her knowing they're going to be in a song. But music is love music is in every genre, from opera to rock to classical to country. It's there, and it is a big part of the music industry. Jewelry. So this is really my home. I was at Tiffany for 12 years. Everything Tiffany sells is about love. And they spend a lot of time thinking about all the different love events. So engagement rings are certainly the biggest part of their business, but we also thought about when you get married and then you have anniversaries every year and you have birthdays every year and there's Mother's Day and Father's Day, and then the baby arrives, and then when you're getting married you register, and you have, I'll never forget sitting in a focus group at Tiffany on bridal registries, and the top bride was in there. She received over $100,000 of gifts just from Tiffany by registering. So this is huge. Tiffany alone does $3.6 billion. It has the second highest sales per square foot in retail, which to me is one of the most important statistics on earth. Does anybody know who has the largest? Twice the $3,000 a square foot. Who in retail? Apple. $6,000. Oh my God, it's unbelievable. Tiffany's amazing. But about 10 years ago, something called Blue Nile online started selling engagement rings. I absolutely said, no way. Who would want an engagement ring bought online that they couldn't see, they couldn't have gotten educated about? It's been very successful and is one of the largest jewelry sites online. Has anybody used Blue Nile? Good? Good experience? Yes, I bought earrings. Well, there you go. Okay. Fragrance, all about love. One of the silliest things you could give. Nobody needs fragrance, and yet ad after ad after ad. And fragrance just continues to grow, all about love. We all have our favorite fragrances. The U.S. fragrance business was up 6% in 2012. It is a $5.2 billion business. Think of the ad spending. Think of the amount of space in stores that are devoted to high-end fragrance all the way down to your drugstore, as well as QVC. It's a huge, very serious business. I get to tell a little bit of a secret. I worked at Chanel for a time. Anybody know where Chanel No. 5, the fragrances, are made? Answer? Well, you would think Paris, and for a good chunk of the world, it is made in France, but U.S. Chanel No. 5, which is over $100 an ounce, is made in Piscataway, New Jersey. It's a huge vat. They throw those oils in, they throw those flowers in, boom, 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 and out comes your little $100 bottle, which smells very good, but it is made in New Jersey. Don't tell anybody I told you that. And on to my favorite, candy. Oh my God, I often get asked, I just left Dylan's Candy Bar, where I was president and COO, and I'm often asked, did I worry about it being a health danger? Did I feel like I was giving crack to kids, something like that? And I did not say what I wanted to say. Candy is not gonna go away. It is one of the greatest indulgences. I'm not saying you should eat it all the time. A little every day is not so bad, and there's certainly better candy. The rest of the world is going to natural candy without the very bright colored dyes. So next time you're in Europe or the UK, you're gonna see it's gonna look a little bit flat to you, or even if you go to Whole Foods, look at their candy. Candy and Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is actually the 4th largest holiday for candy. Number 1, Christmas time. Number 2, Halloween. Easter. Easter's bigger than Halloween. 3, Halloween. 4, Valentine's Day. It really matters to the candy industry what day of the week Valentine's Day falls on, which I found absolutely fascinating. If Valentine's Day falls on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, it is really a drugstore holiday, because guys don't really plan ahead that much, and they're grabbing it at their local QV, their Walgreens or whatever, the box. If it's on a weekend, women expect a lot more. You've got time to go out to dinner, you've got time to think about it more. An amazing statistic, though, this year, online sales for Valentine's Day are up to 26% of spending, which means people are thinking about it a lot farther. Now, since Valentine's Day is Thursday, has anybody bought their present yet for anybody? Okay, anybody mailed a card now that postage is 46 cents? Killing the business, absolutely, Valentine's Day card. Valentine's Day started for all of us pretty much when we were kids, and you used to give them out. Do we remember that in elementary school? And that's sort of all going away, because you can email a free Valentine's Day. You can email a picture of flowers even. You really don't have to give anything anymore. So we'll see what happens, but a lot of changes. The flower industry, enormous, $32 billion industry. Valentine's Day is number 3. Christmas is 1, what's 2? Mother's Day, everybody gives their mother flowers, or maybe fragrance. Easter's 4, Thanksgiving 5. Flowers is between 1-800-Flowers, FTD, all the local florists. It's just a huge love category that too is doing just fine. And then we go to all the other special occasions, anniversaries, birthdays, everything. So in 2012, Valentine's Day, $17.6 billion. I love where Valentine's used to be to where they're going. So in the Stone Age, you can see the guy just hit the woman over the head and dragged her, and that was Happy Valentine's Day. But today, you've got the lovely couple sitting there texting each other while at dinner. world has changed. And this is a wonderful one with the gentlemen buying things and the women returning them. It says a lot. And of course, Absolute Vodka even had to get into Valentine's Day, which I love. Biggest love event there is, weddings. Average couple spends $27,000. Anybody married here? Is that about right? Give or take? Maybe a little bit under even. You can spend more money on weddings than anything there is. And I had to stick in the emerging market. Put your politics aside. We want legal gay marriage in the business sector. It's fantastic. It's a whole new world that we can market to. More weddings, more the merrier. And you can see the statistic from New York City, what that means. 2.5 million weddings in the United States every year. It's a $50 billion business. There's nothing second. It's just enormous. By the time you add the ring, the photographer, the place, the liquor, the food, it just adds up very, very, very quickly. And now we've got travel. Anybody have a destination wedding? A wonderful way to get your guests to help pay for your wedding. I went to one this summer in Puerto Rico. 16% of weddings are now destination weddings, and it's a $16 billion business. And then you add into that just the honeymoon itself. So you can see where all these numbers add up, and these are all love, 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 love. And I, too, had to touch on reality television. These are some of the most successful shows that are out there, and even if none of us will admit to watching Say Yes to the Dress, who could miss it? It's fantastic. And they're huge, and there are more and more of them, and they don't seem to be going away. So my hypothesis, and it's a question, and I hope we have time for a little bit of discussion, but you always hear the phrase, sex sells, right? But does sex sell more than love? And I would say, no way, absolutely no way. All of these categories based on love, I think add up to a much bigger number than if I did the same presentation on sex. But I leave it to you guys to figure that out. And I thank you very much, and I even have a Valentine's Day present for everybody. Thank you. Me up there. These are conversation hearts. Does everybody think of Valentine's Day when you see them, right? They're only made around Valentine's Day. Cherish them.
So I guess actually divorce is probably also good for the marriage business, right? Because it generates more weddings.
Well, true, and there are more divorce parties. That is a trend.
Okay.
But,
Okay, so in the presence of Scott, I have to share, so go ahead.
I actually had a question on this point, because I was curious, since a third of the population of those are single, could that be attributed to the divorce rate increasing, or single people, young people, just living longer to get married, or does that affect you?
Yeah, there's a few things. So that number spans age groups, so of adults from 21 to yeah. So there's a few reasons probably why the number is so high. One has to do with high divorce rates. The other has to do with an increasing number of Americans who cohabitate but don't legally get married. And those numbers are increasing, so a lot of people. But really in that number is people who are, so they could be casually dating, but they're not in a committed relationship, engaged, married, domestic partnership. So it's more that are truly single, not in a committed relationship. Part of it has to do with divorce, part of it has to do with less reliance, sort of given a whole bunch of sort of socioeconomic factors on needing to be married in America. part of it is also historical. So if we look at evidence from the 1950s, there are all these psychiatrists who wrote that people in the 1950s that everyone except for the sort of mentally ill could and should wed. So it's a very different image of what we have of marriage and families and couples today. It was so extreme actually that not only the classic model is, if women weren't married when they left their 20s, and let's say in the 1950s, if women weren't married by the age of 30, she was considered a spinster and she could never really have a healthy relationship. And but at the same time, you could be a single man in the 1950s and you might be denied a bank loan. If you were about 35 as a male and went to a bank and you were single, they would say, "What's wrong with you? You're not married. We're not giving you money." So there's been real social consequences in U.S. history, and that's changed rather dramatically in the last few decades, creating sort of an opportunity to be single.
Have television shows like Sex and the City or Friends that really romanticize the whole, being single in your 30s and still having a great life? Like, has that had an impact on dating and marriage, would you say?
Yes and no. I think it fundamentally has an impact on our stories, on what we think that dating should be, and what we think that. So I've taught an undergraduate course on love, on the science of romantic love, and I always love the stories that students come in with, particularly when they're underclassmen, of sort of what a romantic relationship is supposed to be. And I say that it's a terrible idea. You really don't want your relationship to look anything like that. But we often have these images of what we think dating should be, what we think relationships should be. And if you watch something like, let's say, Millionaire Matchmaker, which I confess to watching fairly recently, and there are these very clear rules that people are supposed to follow in their dating. Well, you can kiss, and if you kiss, but you can't go home with them, and you can't. So we have these sort of ideas that are very much driven from the media, not necessarily driven from what our parents told us.
I just want to add from a business standpoint, Sex and the City is phenomenal. Magnolia Bakery, anybody been there? Put on the map. I mean, the greatest cupcakes, pudding, all that kind of stuff. There's a bus tour you can take in New York that goes to all the places the girls eat and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, they help.
And it just reminded me, something I think that's interesting about Sex and the City, actually, is a particular example. So is everyone here familiar with the characters? Here we go. So let's take Samantha for a moment, who is the character who actually places sexual pleasures above, let's say, the traditional romantic relationship. So what psychologists often call the Madonna-whore dichotomy, and I hate the expression. In men, it's called the cad-dad dichotomy. Believe it, male psychologists came up with these terms. But the concept is that a woman, or anyone really, who focuses on their sex life above their romantic relationship life has all these other problems. And that's the sort of classic story that we see with Samantha for seasons. And then towards the very end, she struggles to try and find this healthy, normal romantic relationship. So there's also these ideas of when you deviate outside, if you do not follow that kind of traditional American script of having a romantic relationship, oh yeah, it can be fun, but you can't ever really have that normalcy, that you have to be different fundamentally from everyone else. So I think there's also a much larger issue going on, even still today, about those types of things.
This question, I guess, is for Maggie. In industries, especially at Tiffany's, where so much of your sales are driven by love and by these events, do you essentially sit around and think about what is sort of the next level of event that we can kind of come up with to show love that you should buy a gift for? For example, all of a sudden, I guess, push gifts for women who have a baby are a big thing, and you get diamonds for doing that. But is that something that essentially Tiffany's and the jewelry industry sort of came together?
Absolutely. I assume most things don't just happen. Every now and then they do, but absolutely. Another gift, Tiffany. So when you're in Tiffany and you've got the wonderful experience of the engagement ring and that whole thing, immediately the salesperson is trained to try to get the bride to buy something for her husband as a gift, a watch. I used to be head of watches, and that was a huge business. So we'll make up holidays for every day of the year. You bet. We need them.
Question?
In your research, it showed that there was like a short-term impact on the stock price. Have you found anything that gives a long-term impact or anything like that?
Well, not in this study. So, so there is some research about how the, there's actually some people went through annual reports and looked at how big the CEO's picture was in the annual report. And so if they really are quite pleased with themselves, they might take a whole page for their picture. But if they're more modest, a smaller picture. And they showed that was actually, so the size of the picture in the annual report is actually negatively correlated with firm performance. So that's something, and so and so maybe that just looking at the size of the picture tells you something about their management style, and that actually ends up having an effect on firm value, which is sort of a longer term thing. But no, I mean in our study we're looking at really just short term effects, and it would be pretty surprising, I think. I mean, even if you take a very weak kind of view of something like market efficiency, I mean, it would be surprising if markets were so inefficient that just the way a person looks on television for a short period of time had some kind of long-term meaningful impact on prices. I think would be kind of strange. It's kind of fun to sort of point out that it looks like there's a short-term effect.
More questions? Quick question. So the evidence that both of you have provided, is there any regularity, internationally speaking? That is, for example, wider faces in the United States have the same impact as wider faces in Europe or in Asia?
I'm not aware of any international research on the sort of financial aspects of it, but I know, and I'm sure Justin can speak to, the kind of stuff that's been shown from an evolutionary biology perspective is global, right?
Yeah, so a lot of the sort of general trends tend to be fairly universal. There are some unique patterns to unique populations, but for the most part, things, so facial width actually, the reason why that's interesting is it's associated with testosterone, so there's a bunch of things that are associated with testosterone. One is with, if you hold up your hand and you look at your second digit and your fourth digit, so the ring finger and the pointer finger, the distances between them, it's called your 2D/4D ratio. And it's actually, arguably, it's determined by the amount of testosterone that you're bathed in when you're in utero. And it's been associated with all sorts of things like aggression and sexual orientation, all sorts of.
And there's a recent paper in Finance that shows that the ratio of those two essentially determines how aggressive and successful is a CEO.
Exactly. So these are, and facial width is another marker, but that tends to be juvenile testosterone. So digit ratios are in the womb, and there's facial width, there's hairlines, there's all sorts of different markers. Height is actually a classic one. And for example, on height, something that we see on online dating and we see in every population in the world is women almost universally prefer men that are taller than them. So there are certain markers that are associated with biological function, like testosterone, that seem to be pretty consistent in these different domains. And width is associated with attraction. And if we look at attraction, it's not just, in this case, the other literature suggests that more attractive people, they get paid more for the equal amount of work. They get promotions sooner, they can climb corporate ladders quicker. So there's a lot of things that I think are relevant to when we think about business, not just in sort of how popular they are in the lunchroom, which arguably is also a business transaction.
Yeah, my question is regarding the market research. Do you think what kind of impact do you think day traders can take advantage of it? So instead of studying Excel, studying the 10 page, they just look at the list of people who's gonna appear on TV and figure out how attractive the guys are and determine in the next few minutes after we go on TV and the stock prices will change.
Yeah, I mean, if you take our result literally, it would suggest that if you see someone appear on television on CNBC when the market's open, and you think that everyone would agree that that person is really not good looking, you should very quickly buy the stock, and within a couple minutes sell it. But I mean, I think the practicalities of implementing something like that, you could try. what we're saying is that there is an effect, but yeah, very short-lived.
Yeah, I would love to see you guys work together with the students working in the trading room.
I mean, I think the better answer to that is there's probably other techniques that would work better. I wouldn't probably put that at the top of the top. If I were running a hedge fund, this wouldn't be like the first thing.
Although it might influence, if from the company side, it might also influence who your spokesperson is, right? If you're thinking about who you're putting on so in this case, many of the CEOs are functioning as spokesperson, which can vary in companies. So for instance, I work with Match, and it's the scientific team. We're the spokesman for the company. They don't put the CEO, and actually she's a good-looking woman, so she could go based on these. But we do think you can think about who it is who's going to do media for companies based on.
So given that a lot of these results tie on the amount of testosterone, and you're saying not a lot of women are featured in the number of CEOs, and we know the number of chief officers who are female has remained at, I think, 17%. It hasn't really risen despite increasing amounts of education and all these different things. Has there been any study into the biological factors of why that might be? That it might be simply biological, that people can't accept women in those roles? I don't know if there's any studies kind of focusing on females instead of most females.
Females.
I
there is evidence actually that female CEOs and female executives have higher testosterone than other women. But there's two things that can be happening there. Testosterone works in two ways. One is you can have baseline high testosterone, and that might make you more aggressive, and not just aggressive. It could also make you more. It actually makes you more socially skilled. It has also allows a better memory. There's other things that testosterone are linked to, which is why. Actually, on a university campus, if you ask a lot of female faculty who are postmenopausal, a very large number of them take testosterone supplementation. And it's because of the estrogen and the testosterone, so it's not just for the sex drive, probably shouldn't put that thought in your mind about your faculty, but partly it has to do with cognitive function, so testosterone and estrogen. But women but testosterone can work in two ways. You can have a high amount that impacts your behavior, but your actual behavior can impact your testosterone. So if we look at primates, when a male primate assumes lead of a group and their coloration changes and their body mass doubles, that has to do with a surge of testosterone that happens from assuming the position of lead. So that's arguably what happens in the cases of some women, but we do see spikes in testosterone. So there are that, but the same metrics aren't the same. You wouldn't look at a woman's jaw width to measure testosterone, so it's different metrics.
I don't know, but this question is quite interesting. Is there any evidence that males do not want to have a female leader? Because the point is, why is it that education has increased for females?
So I mean, so the one study that comes to mind, which isn't exactly this, but potentially relevant. So actually, a graduate of IU who is now a professor at Michigan, Amy Dittmar, wrote a finance professor who looked at, so I've forgotten, there's a European country, or maybe it was even the European Union, instituted a rule that public companies had to have a certain number of females on the board of directors. And they looked after that rule change, and so that you can think of that as like an exogenous shock. It's like that they're being forced to change their behavior. And they showed that after that rule change, performance of those companies improved on some dimensions, and their risk-taking went down. And so, one possibility is that the reason you have something like a glass ceiling is that, maybe they're just, and I think the motivation for this rule change was that we need more women on boards of directors so that they have more experience and can become, CEOs or whatever. There's, from an economics, from a finance perspective, there's not a lot of, I'm not aware of research in that. I think people are starting to look at it. One other study I'll tell you that is about testosterone that is, so when you are, and Justin will correct me because I have a very limited understanding of biology, but if you are a twin and you are in the same gestational sac, you are exposed to the testosterone, or the hormones of your twin. And so there's a recent study that looked at Swedish twins. So and basically what this means is if you have two boys, they are two twins in the same sac, they're going to each have exposed to more testosterone than if they were on their own. girls with male twins are going to be exposed to more testosterone than if they had a female twin or no twin, and girls with and two girls are going to have no or less. So what the study actually did was it tracked these twins when they were older and looked at risk taking in their personal investment portfolios, and they showed that women who have a male twin take more risk in their personal portfolios than if they had a female twin. And so basically that being exposed in utero to more testosterone was associated with more risk-taking in their portfolios 30, 40 years later. And there's actually a professor here, Siri Turchison, who's done some work on testosterone levels and entrepreneurship and sort of risk-taking and that sort of thing. So I think there is more of this kind of work that's being done between sort of biologists and economists, sort of thinking about how these kinds of hormonal effects matter over the long run.
If it makes you feel any better, it's a little bit off the subject. Google Women on Board. There is a major movement. I just went to a great program in New York that they really feel the way to get more women CEOs is to get even more women on board. It really, this rule hasn't been so successful, and there's a real big push for that.
Justin, are you aware how Match.com defines and measures success?
Yes and no. So it depends a little bit on the matching system. So Match.com has several subsidiaries, including Chemistry.com as a sister site, and they use a matching profile system. So Chemistry.com is actually one of the largest mating experiments ever done in the world. It uses a personality matching system. And then Match.com itself is almost more like an open, you sort of can go on and look for whoever you want and communicate with people. So often if people get in relationships, they're asked to then communicate back. And actually in the headquarters in Dallas, the walls are lined with people's wedding pictures who have met on Match. So part of it is done through, so there's two ways. One is part of it is done through people who have used the company. The other are these nationally representative studies that are done using US Census populations, so the right number of, based on the population. And from those, they're not necessarily, some people are on online dating and some are on Match, but they're not necessarily customers. And those studies tell us a little bit more. And those studies actually suggest that up to about 30% of people have met their most recent partner on the internet, and just exclusively on online dating sites, it's around 20 to 25%. And Match.com appears to be the leader in that sense. So it is, the technology is radically changing the way that we're meeting people, and the sort of popular commercial is 20% of people have met their spouse on Match, but in more general terms, in terms of online dating, it's fundamentally changing the way people are meeting. So that, in my understanding, those are the two ways. Some are polling Match, and then the others are the national representative. Sometimes it's hard to follow people because they'll find, you can imagine going on a dating site, you find someone, you fall in love, and where are you going to go back to the dating site? Last thing you need is your partner to see you going back on the dating site.
Your partner's on.
Yeah.
Okay, you got a question. One last question.
Yeah, so we're all future business managers, and I'm curious to know if anybody has any thoughts on how you try to combat these trends if you're not classically good looking, but you still want to be compensated well, and you hope to advance within a company.
So I think we're, it's a good question actually. I think, we're talking about pretty, at least, the kind of sort of research that we're talking about pretty marginal effects. First of all, we're looking at CEOs. These guys are successful. Some of them are ugly, some of them, are good looking, and they're all successful. They're all, they're CEOs of big companies, and I'm sure, very well compensated. Let me answer a slightly different question. So there's for a long time been research about how height is correlated with success in all kinds of dimensions. U.S. presidents are much taller than the general population, and the people who are taller get paid more and that sort of thing. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor who did some research that what they showed is that it actually doesn't matter how tall you are now. It matters how tall you were in 10th grade. And so basically, if you take two people who both ended up being 6'2", But one of them reached 6'2" by the time he was in 10th grade, and one of them was, had a growth spurt later and, maybe was in 12th grade and was shorter in 10th grade. The person who was taller in high school at a younger age is actually going to be more successful on these kinds of measures. And so what that research showed is it's not about how the person looks at you. It's not what you look like today. It's not how you are today. It's probably something like how confident you are, how you were treated in high school, how you think about yourself. And so, I think that there's sort of an optimistic kind of message in that research, in that it's more about sort of your own, how you carry yourself, how you think about your worth or whatever, and it's not so much necessarily just the kind of snap judgments that other people are making about how you look.
But shame on the ugly CEO's PR department. There's media training, there's a stylist. He should have practiced and looked at the fact that he was looking bizarrely, got new glasses or something. He didn't need to look that bad.
I think from a sort of a biological, from an evolutionary perspective, things like fashion, they're in-group signifiers, right? So the way someone dresses, or the way they speak, or the way that those are stylists, they're not just a matter of looking good in a classic biological sense. Do you look healthy? Do you look like... it's a matter of sort of fitting in with a group and being part of the in-group. So you sort of want to have the right... You should expect the right signifiers. Leaders have the right signifiers. And even if we look at our sort of favorite artists, music artists, and they have certain cultural signifiers, and some deviate, and that's what makes them really interesting and unique. But they don't deviate too much. If they deviate too much, they're strange, and we don't want to be involved with them. So I think it's also a mix of sort of thinking about these, and there are all sorts of products so there's something now called liquid trust, and it's being marketed actually to people and businesses, and it's oxytocin. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide hormone, and the idea is you spray yourself in oxytocin and you go into a boardroom and everyone trusts you because oxytocin has been associated with trust in these financial goods. So my colleague and I were actually in Maggie's neck of the woods. We're in the Upper East Side, and someone sent us liquid trust, and we doused each other. It smells like alcohol. We doused each other in liquid trust, and we go out to lunch, and the two of us are like two kids, and we lean over and go, think the server's being nicer than usual? I think they filled up my iced tea more. So and you're trying to really think of these, and of course it's sort of. I'm reluctant to say it's actually doing anything, but the idea there are these products, but even things like perfumes and colognes, what are they doing? They're changing our smell. Well, smell is fundamentally something that biologically we pick up on. When someone's sick, you can smell it. They smell differently. When someone's really attractive, they also smell more attractive too. So attraction is actually linked to quality of smell. There are all these sorts of things that we might want to think about. The way one represents oneself is this sort of, I think of it as this kind of biosocial interaction. So thinking about fashion is thinking about in-group, out-group. Thinking about smell is thinking about health, and sort of how you can purposely manipulate those to your benefit.
Okay, with that note on liquid trust, end up, and thanks for coming.